3 true scary stories from Reddit that will leave you terrified. The room is quiet, save for the occasional creak of old floorboards and the faint hum of a distant radiator. Outside, the winter wind howls, rattling the windows with icy insistence. A dimly lit desk, cluttered with papers and a flickering candle, casts jagged shadows against the walls. Sitting there, I shuffle through a stack of printed stories, each page marked by tales of terror and encounters with the inexplicable. Have you ever felt it? That subtle, unshakable sensation of being watched, when the hair on your neck rises and your pulse quickens for no apparent reason? You glance over your shoulder, telling yourself it's nothing, but the feeling lingers, refusing to fade. What if it wasn't just your imagination? These are my stories. They belong to people like you, who took to Reddit's darkest corners, compelled to share what they could no longer keep to themselves. They're raw, unnerving, and dripping with authenticity. Every word carries the weight of someone's sleepless nights and hesitant footsteps through dimly lit hallways. These are the moments they couldn't forget, and neither will you. As I read through them, I couldn't help but feel a creeping unease. My room grew colder, the shadows deeper, and the occasional flicker of the candles seemed less random, more deliberate. Was it the stories playing tricks on my mind, or something else entirely? There's something about the night, isn't there? Its stillness amplifies every sound, every shadow, every flicker of doubt in your mind. Tonight, I invite you to join me in stepping into the unknown. These stories may start as words on a page, but they have a way of embedding themselves into your thoughts. Long after you've turned out the lights, they'll whisper to you, just as they did to me. Story 1. The Shadow Visitor. The apartment was perfect, or at least that's what Clara had thought when she first signed the lease. After years of roommates, noise, and cramped spaces, this cozy suburban unit was her retreat. A small balcony overlooked a quiet street, and sunlight poured through the living room window every morning, igniting dreams of peace and productivity. As a freelance graphic designer, Clara spent most of her time at home, surrounded by her plants, sketchbooks, and the warm hum of her laptop. It started subtly. The first time Clara noticed something off, she blamed it on her own absent-mindedness. She'd always been scatterbrained, especially when deadlines loomed. A light left on in the kitchen when she was sure she'd turned it off. A slight breeze nudging her bedroom door open even though the windows were closed. But then the feelings began, an odd heaviness in the air, the distinct sensation of being watched. It came in waves, sharp and sudden, leaving her glancing over her shoulder or pausing mid-step. At first, she laughed it off. New place jitters, she told herself. Yet the unease lingered, and her sunny apartment began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a stage with an unseen audience. One evening, while working late, Clara's lamp flickered. The rhythmic dimming and brightening of the bulb sent a chill down her spine. She tapped the lamp's base, fiddled with the switch, but the flickering continued until it didn't. It stopped as suddenly as it had started. The next night, things escalated. It was past midnight when Clara stirred in her sleep, awakened by a sound she couldn't place. At first, she thought it was her neighbor's TV, a faint, muffled noise that seemed to seep through the walls. Then it came again, louder this time, a creak, the sound of weight shifting on old floorboards. Her heart pounded as she sat up in bed, her eyes adjusting to the dim light spilling in from the street lamp outside. And then she saw it. At the foot of her bed stood a figure, tall and unmoving. It was nothing more than a shadow, blacker than the surrounding darkness, but its form was unmistakable. Clara froze, her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't scream, couldn't move, couldn't think. For what felt like an eternity, the shadow remained there, its edges blurred, but its presence undeniable. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The next morning, Clara convinced herself it had been a dream, a manifestation of stress, exhaustion, or an overactive imagination. But the fear had taken root, and she found herself jumping at every creak and whisper her apartment seemed to emit. Determined to prove herself wrong, or right, Clara ordered a set of security cameras. She installed them strategically, one in the living room, one in the kitchen, and one aimed directly at her bedroom. The devices gave her a false sense of security, a semblance of control. A few days passed with nothing out of the ordinary. Clara began to relax, telling herself it was all in her head. Then, late one night, she received a motion alert on her phone. Her blood ran cold as she opened the app and watched the recorded footage. The video showed her bedroom, bathed in faint moonlight. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, a shadow crept into the frame. It moved across the room, its form fluid and unnerving. Yet there was no source, no figure casting it. The shadow drifted toward her bed, lingered for a moment, and then vanished. Clara replayed the video over and over, her fingers trembling. There was no logical explanation, no intruder, no tricks of light, just the unshakable truth. She wasn't alone. Clara couldn't shake the image from the footage. The shadow's movement had been deliberate, almost purposeful, and the thought of it lingering near her while she slept made her stomach churn. She barely slept the next night, her eyes darting toward every flickering shadow, her ears straining to catch every creak or whisper. By morning, she knew she needed answers. After hours of fruitless internet searches about unexplained phenomena, Clara stumbled upon a local history forum dedicated to her town. She hesitated before typing her query. Does anyone know about strange occurrences in the Rosewood Apartments? The replies came quickly, but one stood out. You live there? That place has a history. Back in the 80s, a woman was murdered in apartment 3C, stabbed to death by her fiancé. Rumor has it her shadow still lingers, looking for justice or maybe revenge. People say she doesn't leave her apartment, but who knows? Maybe she's tired of staying put. Clara's stomach dropped. Apartment 3C. Her apartment. The forum user's comment was accompanied by an old newspaper clipping. The article detailed the tragic story of a young woman named Evelyn Harper, who had been brutally killed by her jealous fiancé in what was now Clara's bedroom. Though the fiancé was arrested, strange reports had surfaced over the years. Residents hearing whispers, seeing shadows, and feeling watched. Clara's logical mind rebelled. She didn't believe in ghosts, let alone vengeful shadows. But the footage, the presence she'd felt, it all lined up too perfectly. That night, Clara decided to confront the mystery head-on. Armed with her phone, she set up a recording session in her bedroom. The camera was positioned to capture the entire room, and a small voice recorder sat on her nightstand. She turned off the lights, sat on the edge of her bed, and addressed the darkness. Evelyn, she began, her voice trembling. If you're here, I just want to understand. I'm not here to hurt you. Please show me a sign. For several minutes, there was nothing but the sound of Clara's breathing. Then, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Clara's breath formed faint clouds in the cold air, and the shadow appeared, this time materializing directly in front of her. It wasn't just a shape anymore. It seemed denser, more defined. Clara's heart pounded as the room filled with an oppressive silence. Then, through the static of the voice recorder, she heard it. Clara. The voice was faint, distorted, but unmistakably human. Clara's name, spoken by something that shouldn't exist. Panic gripped her, and she bolted from the room. She spent the night at a friend's house, clutching the recorder and camera footage as if they were talismans against the terror she had just faced. The next morning, she replayed the recordings, hoping her memory had twisted the events in her fear. But it hadn't. The shadow had spoken her name. Unable to bear the thought of returning to her apartment, Clara broke her lease and moved out within the week. She left behind most of her belongings, fearing they might carry whatever haunted her. For a while, she felt safe in her new place, a modern loft across town. The bright lighting, open spaces, and lack of eerie creaks gave her a sense of relief. But the sense of peace didn't last long. A week after moving in, Clara woke in the middle of the night. The room was silent, the kind of stillness that feels unnatural. Slowly, she turned her head toward the corner of her bedroom. There was the shadow. It hadn't stayed behind in the apartment. It had followed her, and as she stared into the darkness, she understood with chilling clarity. It wasn't the apartment that was haunted. It was her. Story 2. The disconnected call. Matt sat in the living room of his childhood home, the weight of his grief pressing down on him. His mother had passed just 2 weeks ago, leaving him as the sole heir to the old, creaky house. The once warm and bustling home now felt suffocatingly silent, every creak and groan of the floorboards amplifying his loneliness. Late one night, as Matt flipped aimlessly through the channels on an old TV, his phone vibrated on the coffee table. The glow of the screen cut through the darkness, displaying a number he knew all too well, his mother's. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. It had to be a glitch, a cruel joke played by the universe. Still, his hand moved almost instinctively, picking up the phone and swiping to answer. "Hello," he said, his voice trembling. There was static on the other end, a faint crackle that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Then, through the noise, he heard it, a whisper, fragile yet unmistakable. "Matt, don't go to the basement." His heart raced, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The line went dead. Matt stared at the phone in disbelief, his mind racing. It had to be a prank or a technical glitch. Yet the voice had been so eerily familiar, so unmistakably hers. The next morning, Matt tried to brush it off, but the warning lingered in his mind. The basement had always been an afterthought, a damp and forgotten space filled with old boxes and unused furniture. His mother had rarely mentioned it, except to grumble about needing to organize it someday. As the day wore on, curiosity gnawed at him. He ventured into his mother's room, a space he'd been avoiding since her death. The air was heavy with the scent of lavender and old books. He started going through her belongings, hoping to find a clue, anything to explain the strange call. Tucked beneath a pile of blankets in her closet, he found an old leather-bound diary. Its pages were yellowed and filled with his mother's neat handwriting. The entries started off mundane, recounting daily chores and small triumphs. But as he flipped further, the tone shifted. "Something isn't right in this house." One entry read, "I hear noises at night, scratching like someone trying to get out." Another passage sent a chill down his spine. "I've stopped going to the basement. It feels wrong, like I'm not alone down there. I don't want Matt to ever find out." Matt's hands trembled as he closed the diary. His mother had been a practical woman, not one to believe in ghosts or the supernatural. If she'd felt compelled to write this, it must have been serious. That night, unable to resist the pull of the diary's words, Matt decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and his phone, he descended the creaky stairs to the basement. The air grew colder with each step, and a faint, musty smell filled his nostrils. The beam of his flashlight swept across the room, revealing cobweb-covered furniture and stacks of boxes. But as he moved closer to the far wall, his light caught something that made him stop in his tracks. Scratch marks. They ran vertically along the concrete wall, deep grooves as though made by fingernails or claws. The sight sent a jolt of fear through him. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "Don't go to the basement." Matt knelt down, running his fingers over the marks. They were real, tangible, and fresh enough to suggest that whatever had made them hadn't been gone for long. A sudden sound, a faint whisper, broke the silence. It seemed to come from behind the wall. His breath quickened, and he pressed his ear against the cold surface. "May I?" It was her voice. He stumbled back, his flashlight clattering to the floor. The whisper turned into a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the basement. Without thinking, Matt bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind him. He didn't sleep that night, his mind replaying the events in the basement over and over. Whatever was down there, it wasn't his mother, but her warning had been real. And now, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just in the basement anymore. The morning sun barely penetrated the oppressive gloom that seemed to envelop the house. Matt sat in the kitchen, staring blankly at the untouched cup of coffee in front of him. His thoughts were consumed by the scratch marks in the basement and the faint, haunting voice he'd heard the night before. Determined to find answers, he returned to his mother's diary. He combed through the entries, hoping for more clarity, until he stumbled upon one dated 3 months before her death. "I've locked it away. I don't know how long the seal will hold, but I can't risk it getting out. Matt must never go down there. Matt's blood ran cold. What had she locked away? What had she tried so desperately to keep hidden? He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the answer lay in the basement, behind those ominous scratches. Later that evening, armed with renewed determination, Matt descended the basement stairs once more. The air was heavier than before, almost suffocating. He scanned the room with his flashlight until it landed on a corner he hadn't explored the previous night. There, partially hidden behind an old stack of boxes, was a small, rusted chest. Its hinges were corroded, and a heavy padlock hung from its latch. His heart raced as he crouched down, brushing away years of dust and cobwebs. Matt fetched a hammer and chisel from the tool cabinet upstairs. With a few forceful strikes, the padlock snapped open. He hesitated, staring at the chest, a voice in the back of his mind whispering that he shouldn't proceed. But curiosity, or perhaps desperation, overpowered his fear. The lid creaked as he lifted it. Inside, wrapped in a tattered cloth, were a bundle of small, brittle bones. Human bones. His stomach turned, and he instinctively recoiled. Beside the remains was a locket. He picked it up, his fingers trembling, and opened it to reveal a faded photo of his mother. He sat back, his mind spinning. The implications were horrifying. Had his mother been involved in something unspeakable? The bones were far too small to belong to an adult. A child, perhaps? As he grappled with the discovery, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He froze. Slowly, he pulled it out, and his breath hitched when he saw the caller ID mom. His hand shook as he answered. "Hello." This time, there was no static, no faint whisper. Her voice came through loud and clear, filled with terror and urgency. "It's free," she screamed. "Get out, Matt. Run." The call ended abruptly, and a deafening silence filled the air. Then, the basement seemed to come alive. The walls trembled, and a low growl echoed from somewhere unseen. Shadows began to twist and writhe, forming shapes that were almost human, but disturbingly wrong. Matt scrambled to his feet, clutching the locket. The air grew colder, and the growl turned into a piercing shriek that made his ears ring. He bolted for the stairs, but the shadows surged forward, reaching for him with claw-like tendrils. The entire house shook as if an earthquake had erupted beneath it. Matt stumbled up the stairs, barely managing to slam the basement door shut behind him. The moment he did, an ear-splitting crash echoed from below. He didn't stop to look back. Grabbing his car keys and a jacket, he fled the house, the locket still clutched tightly in his hand. When he finally stopped, several miles away at a deserted gas station, he turned to look back toward his neighborhood. A faint plume of dust rose in the distance. The house had collapsed in on itself, taking the basement and whatever had been sealed within it with it. Matt sat in his car, his hands trembling. He glanced at the locket, its delicate chain wrapped around his fingers. His mother's face smiled back at him from the photo, but the warmth he once associated with it was replaced by a deep sense of unease. The scars on his arms from the shadow's grasp began to ache. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The entity wasn't gone. It had simply been released. Some family secrets, he realized, were never meant to see the light of day. Story 3. The Doll in the Attic. The old house stood alone at the end of a quiet street, its shutters weathered and peeling, its charm long forgotten by time. Emily had never imagined inheriting such a place, but when her grandmother passed, the house became hers. She had vague childhood memories of visiting the home, of its creaking floors, the smell of lavender mixed with mothballs, and her grandmother's firm warning to never venture into the attic. Now, as a 19-year-old college student, Emily saw the house as an opportunity to escape the cramped dormitories. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. She spent her first few days there cleaning and unpacking, determined to breathe new life into the dusty relic. By the end of the week, she had tackled nearly every room except one, the attic. Armed with a broom, a flashlight, and her curiosity, Emily climbed the narrow, rickety stairs leading to the forbidden space. The attic was a time capsule of her grandmother's life. Stacks of faded letters, boxes filled with lace doilies, and an antique rocking chair surrounded by cobwebs painted a picture of a bygone era. As Emily explored, her flashlight beam caught something unusual in the corner, a bundle wrapped in an old, yellowed cloth. Kneeling down, she carefully unwrapped it, revealing an antique porcelain doll. The doll's pale face was delicately painted, its lips a deep crimson, and its glass eyes a piercing blue. The doll's dress, though tattered, was once a beautiful Victorian gown, complete with intricate lace. Emily shuddered. Something about the doll unsettled her, but she dismissed it as her imagination running wild in the eerie attic. She set it aside and returned to sorting through boxes. That night, however, her unease lingered. As she lay in bed, the house seemed noisier than usual. The creaks and groans of the old wood didn't sound random. They felt deliberate. Her dreams were fragmented, filled with disjointed images of the doll's glassy eyes staring at her. The next morning, Emily went about her routine, trying to shake off the weird feeling. But when she returned to the attic later to finish organizing, she froze. The doll wasn't where she had left it. It now sat in the middle of the attic, its head tilted as if watching the door. "You're being ridiculous," she muttered to herself, picking up the doll and placing it back in the corner. But the following day, she found the doll on the living room couch. Later, it appeared in her bedroom. Each time, Emily tried to rationalize it. Maybe she had forgotten moving it. Maybe it had fallen from somewhere. The turning point came one evening while she was studying in the kitchen. A faint giggle echoed through the house. It was high-pitched, childlike, and unmistakable. Emily froze, the hair on her neck standing on end. She cautiously searched the house, her hands trembling as she clutched a kitchen knife for protection. Every room was empty, but when she opened the door to her bedroom, she let out a sharp gasp. The doll sat upright on her bed, its porcelain hands resting neatly in its lap. "Enough," she whispered, her voice cracking. Emily grabbed the doll and stuffed it into a box, taping it shut and hauling it back into the attic. She placed it in the farthest corner, surrounded by heavy furniture to ensure it couldn't move again. But that night, sleep eluded her. Every creak, every groan of the house felt amplified. At 3 a.m., she woke with a start, her heart racing. The room was eerily cold, and the air felt heavy. Before she could fully orient herself, she felt an oppressive weight on her chest. Her eyes flew open, and she was met with the sight of the doll sitting atop her, its unblinking eyes mere inches from her face. She couldn't scream. The doll's glassy gaze seemed to pierce her soul, holding her in a silent, paralyzing grip. Its small porcelain hand raised slowly, its cold fingers brushing against her cheek. Emily mustered every ounce of strength and shoved the doll off, bolting out of the bed. She grabbed the doll and hurled it into the hallway, slamming the bedroom door behind her. Her breaths came in shallow gasps as she pressed her back against the door, her mind racing. The giggling returned, this time louder and closer. Then, a soft scratching sound began on the other side of the door, as though the doll was trying to claw its way back in. Tears streamed down Emily's face as she whispered to herself, "This can't be real. This can't be real." But deep down, she knew whatever was inhabiting the doll was far more real than she had ever feared. The next day, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She had spent the night in the living room, too frightened to return to her bedroom. The doll's presence lingered in her mind, haunting her thoughts with its cold, lifeless stare. She couldn't explain what had happened or why it was happening, but she knew she had to find out more. Desperation pushed her to the only person who might have answers, her grandmother. The elderly woman had always been a fixture of mystery in Emily's life, with her cryptic words and strange warnings. And now, as Emily began digging through her grandmother's old journals and belongings, she uncovered a chilling truth. The doll wasn't just a random object. It had a history. The porcelain figure once belonged to her great-aunt Margaret, who died tragically at the age of 8. According to the journal, Margaret had been an unusually quiet child, always playing by herself. She was fascinated by the doll, treating it as if it were a living companion. But when a strange illness struck the family, Margaret fell ill and eventually passed away under mysterious circumstances. The doll, however, never left her side. It remained in her bedroom, a reminder of a life cut short. After Margaret's death, her mother, Emily's great-grandmother, began to notice odd occurrences surrounding the doll. Lights flickering, doors slamming, objects moving on their own. Rumors spread about the doll being cursed, and the family, in fear, locked it away in the attic, hoping to rid themselves of its dark influence. Her grandmother's final entry read, "Never touch the doll. If you do, it will come for you. I don't know why, but I fear it will never stop." Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she processed the words. Her grandmother's warning had been clear, but now the doll had found its way to her. The horrifying giggles, the movement, the unnatural weight pressing down on her chest at night. It was all starting to make sense, or perhaps it was making her even more terrified. But Emily wasn't one to back down. She couldn't live in constant fear of a doll. She had to end it. That afternoon, Emily decided to confront the terror head-on. She found a small hammer and, with trembling hands, went to the attic. The doll was there, sitting innocently on the shelf, as if it had been waiting for her. With determination in her eyes, Emily raised the hammer and brought it down hard onto the doll's fragile face. The porcelain shattered, the cracks spreading like veins across its surface. She kept pounding over and over until the doll lay in pieces, its parts scattered across the floor. Breathing heavily, Emily stared at the destruction she had caused. She felt a strange sense of triumph, convinced that she had finally rid herself of the curse. But as she turned to leave, she felt a sudden chill in the air. The temperature dropped so sharply that her breath formed visible clouds. She heard the sound of faint giggling again, this time closer, almost right behind her. She spun around in terror. The doll wasn't broken anymore. It was whole. Its face, though cracked, was still intact, its glass eyes staring coldly at her. "No," Emily whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "This can't be happening." Panicked, she picked up the doll, clutching it in her hands, trying to break it once more. But no matter how hard she tried, no matter how many times she smashed it against the floor or threw it against the wall, the doll remained unscathed. It always reappeared whole. Frustrated, her pulse racing, Emily ran downstairs and grabbed a shovel. She had no other choice. She needed to get rid of it once and for all. She sprinted into the woods behind her house, burying the doll deep in the ground, covering it with dirt until the earth seemed to swallow it whole. Breathing heavily, she stood there for a moment, staring at the freshly disturbed soil. The doll was gone, but as Emily made her way back to the house, she felt the familiar chill of unease creeping over her once more. She glanced over her shoulder, certain she was being watched. The front door was ajar. Heart racing, she entered the house, the silence almost suffocating. But as soon as she stepped into the living room, she froze. The doll sat on the couch, its glass eyes gleaming in the dim light. It was exactly where it had been before, as if it had never left. Terror gripped Emily's chest. She backed away slowly, unable to tear her eyes away from the porcelain figure that seemed to mock her. Then, from the shadows, she heard it, the faint childlike giggle. It echoed throughout the house, louder now, as though the doll was laughing at her futile attempts to escape its grip. And in that moment, Emily realized the horrifying truth. No matter where she went, no matter what she did, the doll would never leave her. It was tied to her, bound by the curse of a long-dead child, and it would follow her until the end of time. She couldn't run anymore. The curse had been unleashed, and there was no escaping it. As the fire crackles quietly in the background, the room grows colder, and the shadows stretch longer across the walls. I've told you the stories, the strange occurrences, the unsettling encounters, the mysteries that lurk just out of sight. But as the night deepens and the clock ticks past midnight, I can't help but reflect on something more unsettling than the tales themselves. These tales remind us that the unknown is always closer than we think. The things we fear, the things we don't understand, are often right under our noses. There's a reason we feel uneasy when the lights flicker, when we hear strange noises in the middle of the night, or when someone seems to be watching us. These sensations aren't just figments of our imagination. They are our senses trying to warn us of the unexplainable forces that surround us. The world is full of shadows, whispers, and eyes that are always watching. And though we may want to brush them off as superstition or coincidence, the truth is, there are more stories like these out there than we care to admit. In fact, there are so many, it's impossible to tell where the line between fiction and reality truly lies. There are people out there who have felt the touch of something cold in the dark, heard the whispers of long-dead voices, or encountered the objects that should never have moved. And while these stories may seem unbelievable to some, they are rooted in something deeply unsettling. The knowledge that the unexplainable doesn't just exist in the realm of fiction. It's real. Maybe the next time you hear a creak in the dark or feel a cold breath on your neck, you'll remember these stories. Perhaps you'll pause, just for a moment, and question the silence around you. You might even wonder if there's something or someone lurking just out of sight, waiting for you to look away. And when that chill runs down your spine, you'll understand. It's not just the wind. It's not just your imagination. It's the world we live in, a place where the unknown is always a step behind us, just out of reach but never truly gone. So, do you believe the shadow, the voice, or the doll could come for you next? Because in the end, the real horror isn't in what you see or hear. It's in what you don't. And sometimes, what you don't see can be far more terrifying than anything your eyes could ever comprehend. Take care, reader. And remember, you might think the stories are finished, but they're only just beginning.